Hello and welcome to the Point Blank Show. My name is Abhishek. Our guest today is Will Cockrell, whose book Everest Incorporated or Everest Inc. has just come out. It tells the story of the renegades and rogues who built an industry at the top of the world. Will has written about Everest, among other peaks, throughout his career spanning over 2 decades and has also been to the base camp not too long ago. Thanks a lot, Will, for doing this.
Oh, thank you, Abhishek. I appreciate it.
Thanks. Given that you've been covering the mountains and adventure sports for a while, Mount Everest is pretty much on everyone's list. What was your first recollection of Everest? How were you introduced to this peak, whether as a child or much later when you thought, all right, this is something that I'd like to cover?
Well, I have been a climber since, maybe early college, right? So I've been a climber most of my life, at least 30 years. So, of course, I was always aware of climbing on Everest. I would say that I never had dreams of going to Everest. And one of my first moments of consciousness about Everest, like a lot of people, because of my age at the time, was 1996. So John Krakauer's book, Into Thin Air, in some ways, even though I was a climber, this was also a big book for me because John Krakauer is an important writer. He's a great journalist and he's a great climber. That book was very meaningful to me. But given my age and where I was, funny enough, one of my early introductions and lenses for Everest was Into Thin Air.
But I heard in one of your other podcasts that you would rather surf than take the mountains. Is that what you do these days?
Yeah. I think rather is not quite the right word. The thing is with my family, my wife and my two little kids, we live in Los Angeles and we live really close to the beach. And so obviously this is the life we embrace and it's wonderful. It's amazing. I live about 5 hours from the mountains, where I like to play. In fact, I'm going tomorrow, the Eastern Sierra. And so it's just harder, right? But I still go up to the Eastern Sierra all the time. I love climbing. I really miss it. But it's hard to do it all the time unless you live in the mountains.
That's amazing. I'll tell you why, because you're a journalist and you get to cover a beat, so to speak, that you enjoy participating in. And that's why one of the reasons why I like your book is that unlike some that have come before it, including Into Thin Air, if I may say, your book is respectful to those amateurs and it doesn't make light of them. And these folks may have deep pockets who want to, challenge themselves and go up the Mount Everest and get to the summit. But oftentimes, journalists elsewhere have made light of it, and we are quick to judge that they don't deserve to be up there. But your book, correct me if I'm wrong, takes at the opposite end. Well, so what is how you question, and then you go on to write stories detailing by having interviewed a bunch of folks. Tell me more about that.
Well, this was interesting. I had a very conscious approach to what you're talking about. It's not just Everest and climbing. It's actually a lot of subjects I've covered in my life. Right? So any subject that has a bad reputation or has built a reputation in a certain way where we maybe have lifted up villains. We have maybe created villains in the narrative of whatever that thing is. A good example is horse racing in this country. This is another sport which is getting a lot of heat right now, and they're creating villains around that sport. It's very easy to do, of course. People love animals. With Everest, I simply said to myself, well, I'm gonna begin this journey, and I'm gonna go talk to a lot of people. And let's see when I start to meet some people I don't like. Do you know what I mean by that? People I don't trust, people I don't like, people who feel selfish or narcissistic or whatever. And I said, I'll just go down this road. And if I talk to 100 people and half of them are egotistical, jerks, then maybe my book would be different.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But when 90% of the people or more are very kind, smart, introspective human beings, it's impossible to that's when it opens the door to say, okay, we need to maybe erase the villain idea and now start over. My book is starting over.
Yeah, and you talk about one Dick Baz, if I remember the character from your book, who started it all, is what you say. And he appears to be one of those guys who seems egotistical. How did he start a new industry? this man from the US, was he? And
Yeah.
he said, without much background in mountaineering, he said one day he decided, let me do the impossible and climb the Mount Everest, when people would have laughed at him.
Absolutely. At the time when he decided to climb it, it was very preposterous. And to be totally honest, people refer to him as the first guided client on Everest, which is not really true because there were no guides on Everest. And the person that was looking after him was not a guide. So it was not a guide relationship, but still it was very important. One of the main reasons that Dick Bass, who was this oil man, rich oil man from Texas, who owned a ski resort in Utah. Very big personality. Everybody loved him. He talked a lot. The truth about his personality is he was very self-deprecating. All his jokes really were at his own expense about how he was not very fit and was kind of bumbling, was a way that he described himself, even though he was more competent than this, right? So he set off to climb Denali, was, I think, the first mountain of real consequence that he went to climb, sort of off the couch is the term we use, like with no preparation. And he did amazing. He just sort of like, the guides who were with him were so impressed and amazed by his stamina. And it was on that trip that he decided he wanted to climb the 7 summits, the highest mountain on each of the 7 continents. And he was the first person to end up doing that, right? And so the 7 summits, because of Dick Bass, became a goal that is not, even though they're mountains, right? They're mountains. But one thing I try to differentiate, it's not a mountaineering goal to climb the 7 summits. Does that make sense?
Yes.
It's whatever goal you have inside that you're trying to conquer. Dick Bass had a fantasy of adventuring. Like, I think Richard Halliburton was one of his early inspirations, sailing the 7 seas, right? Things like this from his childhood imagination. He wasn't a climber and did not want to become a climber. He just wanted to do something beyond impossible, I guess is the way to put it. You can imagine that when he finished, all the people out there saw Dick Bass as themselves, because he didn't sit around talking about how he's a climber and he knows how to use the equipment and it's only for experts. He didn't talk like that.
Right.
And it's not a mountaineering challenge. It's a different kind of challenge.
And he poked fun at himself, you said. I think, did he say that the only kind of running that I've done is to catch a flight with a little bit of my luggage behind me or some such. So he was quite a character. He was at Johnny Carlson's show, which was a big deal back in the, 80s, whenever that was then.
Yeah. 2 weeks after he summited Everest, he was on the Tonight Show, Johnny Carson, 1985. And, you can imagine on that show, to all that audience who don't know anything about the climbing world, he basically was announcing that he chose a goal. He picked a goal, and it was Everest, and he went after it. And that journey is impressive. It's not that you should become a climber. His journey wasn't to say you should become a climber and devote your life to mountain climbing. He said maybe it's about picking a goal, like something that is nearly impossible in your own head, and then doing it. And I think that sparks a lot of people's imagination. Yeah. Whereas if I say, let's go climb this difficult mountain, we have to learn how to use all the equipment, and I want you to prepare for 3 years and learn how to climb, that doesn't spark very many people's imagination.
Right. It also does send a few sparks at home, is what I read, because you also read about another mountaineer who said, each time I try to summit the Everest and I fail, I got to go back and buy a new car for my wife to make it up for my adventure or my fantasy that I'm chasing. So it's something like, it's mad men with a lot of money, or not so much money, but with mad ambitions to do something which I think John Oliver made light in the right way, where people have said, if you're eating a big burger, it is like, it's my Everest, or it's my anything that is difficult, people slap this particular metaphor against it. Yeah. So
it's too many times they do use this one, I think.
Yep. And when did guided climbing, when did that actually take off? And for those who are new to this concept among my listeners, if you could just paint a picture of what guided climbing is in the first place, and when did it actually start taking off?
And do you mean guiding on Everest, or you mean in the world?
Yes, especially on Everest. Yeah.
Okay.
Especially on the Everest. Yeah.
because as you know, it's, the tradition is about a couple hundred years old, beginning in the Alps in France. You had mountain guides were professional mountain guides for a long time before anyone even went to the Himalayas and climbed any mountains. So really the fact that the guiding industry began, I call it the 90s. I say 1992 is the first time that a person was guided to the summit of Everest successfully, paid money to be helped to the top, was the first time in 1992. That's very late in the world of guiding. I mean, they were guiding on Denali in the 60s. It's very new in terms of the mountains around the world. But I think that the Himalaya was the final frontier, the most consequential, kind of frightening mountains to mountaineers. And Everest had an element of the moon or space where they did not quite understand. When the first time we landed on the moon, I think the big question is, what happens when we step outside? We have no idea. We think we know, but we have no idea. And I think that this idea of going to 29,000 feet is same thing. It was sort of like, we think we'll be okay, but like, what if my head just explodes, right? Like, they just don't know what will happen. And I think that when people did summit and people started summiting fairly regularly, this idea of guiding that mountain sounded ridiculous, because it went from being sort of so frightening to being like, well, now actually anybody can come do it as long as you have a good guide. That's an interesting thing. And that's about mountain guides, very misunderstood type of person. A lot of people don't consider them climbers, which is a little unfair. They go up the same mountain over and over and over and over, and so they're not climbers. But they're exceptional people and amazing people and kind of superheroes in their own way. And they had a goal, like a climber has the goal to climb the mountain. Their burning goal inside was to get people up mountains.
Right.
So it's kind of like when they get someone up Everest, it's like the ultimate for them. That's what drove it. That's what drove that popularity.
Got it. But at the beginning, some of the newspapers, did they ridicule the idea? They said it looks like it's a paid holiday because it's guided. Or I think there were some funny ones, including one, was it Sunday Mail? And I quote from your book, it says, dangers include squeezing your balls off and being squashed by an avalanche. This is something that you will be signing up for.
Freezing your balls off. Freezing. Like as in cold, yeah.
Freezing, not squeezing.
Yeah. That would be worse, yes. I think. That's interesting. The criticism came in two ways. It was either humor, making fun of it, which, to be totally honest, that's not as bad in my opinion as making fun of it as in belittling it. Funny enough, I think that to make fun of an Everest client in a good-natured way is, I think, fair, because the people who climb Everest, I recognize myself in those people because I climb mountains to clear my head or to get through a difficult period of my life, like all these things. I understand why people climb Everest. It's funny to make fun of them, right? To say, oh, it's the midlife crisis mountain, right? You know what I mean? For men and women. That's funny, and that's okay. It's okay to laugh at ourselves and think, should I go buy a Ferrari or should I go climb Everest? I don't know.
Right.
So I think the humor, I don't mind it really, but I think the criticism, the sort of how dare you, this sort of notion of, if you want to do this, you're a bad person. If you help people do this, you're greedy and you're also bad. I just don't think that made any sense.
And who are these folks who usually go to the top? Is it doctors, lawyers, you write about some investment bankers to clear their heads, or they've taken a break or a sabbatical? So generally, from your experience, what kind of make is of a person who wants to attempt something like this?
Well, I can mostly only speak for the West, right? That's one thing. And perhaps you want to chime in about your understanding of the Indian population, for instance, because that's really interesting. In the West, in America in particular, where I'm from, it started out as being doctors, lawyers, pilots, these sort of like high stress, high paying jobs. And
Right.
because it made sense because their nature was to always go seek something that was very difficult to do, like medical
Yeah.
school, and that not many people can do, and then conquer it. And they need these in their life. They need
Mm.
one of these maybe every decade, right? To do. Medical school was one, and then the
Yeah.
next time maybe climb Everest. And so that's the model. But that's changed completely because what everybody does for a living is so different now. So you have like a tech millionaire, you have you have people. There was an astronaut that I followed this year, and you
Mm.
have people who made fortunes in fitness or something. There's a lot of like different types of people on the mountain now. They do all have the money to climb Everest, which is not everybody can do that. What they all share is they just happen to need something like Everest in their life to turn a corner.
Mm.
Because I think we turn corners all, throughout our entire life, right? We come to a moment, we feel stuck, we work through it, whether it's with our wife or our partner, and then we turn a corner. And then our job, we turn a corner. Hopefully, we have the sort of the peace and the space to turn that corner without climbing Everest.
Mm.
But for some people, they need
Right.
they need an Ironman triathlon. They need a
Yeah.
marathon. They need, one thing we have here is through hiking. So like the
Oh,
Pacific
okay.
Crest Trail, which runs north to south California, it takes like the whole summer to hike it, right? It's ridiculous. Like people do this.
Oh,
People spend,
okay.
90 days hiking the Pacific Crest Trail every day.
Mm.
These are ridiculous things, but
Yeah.
I guarantee that the motivation for those people is likely to turn some corner is just the same as when someone signs up to climb Mount Everest.
Mm. The need for that break and the rush. We talked about pilots. I think there was somebody had this, I don't know who it was, but when a pilot was asked, please describe me how your job is, he said, it's thousands of hours of boredom punctuated by moments of sheer terror. Uh,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
because and the boredom bit is something that can get to people who might want to, yeah, as you said, maybe buy a Ferrari or attempt a triathlon or one of these things. But how do
Yeah.
you react to criticism, which
Hmm.
is partly justified as well, of amateurs who think who can do it? That's a good start. The reason why they are up there is because they think they can do it, but they are not equipped enough, because there is no great qualification criteria for you apart from perhaps doing a few peaks, or there might be some fine print that please do this before you come to the base camp and then we'll help you get there. There is nothing written in stone. And what might happen is you've got an unqualified climber who might hold up a line at that altitude because he doesn't know what to do next, or the overcrowding on Everest has become such a fashionable thing these days to talk about all those lines near the Hillary step. You've got, there's only one rope that everybody's tugging on to. News stories about people stuck at the summit, which is the size of two ping pong tables, is what John Oliver said in his tonight
Yeah.
in that segment. Now,
Yep.
how do you react to that? Because these guys are not pros and they're anything but. And oftentimes they can tell their professional climber, oh no, I want to disregard your orders and I still want to do it because it's only 200 feet away. But when they do
Yeah.
that, they put themselves in danger, the guide in danger, and also 17 people behind them, because they have to wait until this bloke comes back. So how do you
Yeah.
put that in perspective?
Well, I would like to split that into two things, because one is the criticism is experience is awful. You're going to this majestic mountain in the wilderness, and you're surrounded by all these people waiting in a queue like you're at Disneyland. So the problem is that criticism is false, because nobody goes to Everest for a wilderness experience. People
Hmm.
go to Everest to stand in a queue to get to the top. So it's like saying, "How dare you, go?" Or it's saying you're a terrible person because you're standing in that queue. It's like that's what I knew I had to do. You could judge that person and say, well, if you get pleasure from that, you're strange or bad. I don't know
Hmm.
why you could do that, right? But if you say, uh, so that's part of the criticism is, look at that line. It's ugly. It's disgraceful. It's terrible. That's what people are criticizing. This is a beautiful mountain and there's a big queue of people on it.
Hmm.
Have you ever heard of Half Dome in
I'm
Yosemite?
afraid not.
So
No, I'm
Yosemite
afraid
is
not.
one of our national parks, and Half Dome is one of the most famous features. It's a huge, huge granite slab, 1,000 feet tall or something. And it has a way up the back side, which you have to hold a cable. So it's not climbing. Anybody can do it, but
Mm.
it's like quite steep. And if you fall, you probably would die. But
Oh.
nobody falls. But in the
Mm.
summertime, there is 60,000 people who climb this. Half Dome is one of the most beautiful places on earth, and nobody
Mm.
criticizes Half Dome. But on a summer day, there is a line to the top. I think that in the
Right.
Grand Canyon, Taj Mahal, like these are the different things that part of it. And so now the other
Mm.
criticism is the danger. Are we putting people's lives at danger? And
Mm.
I guess what I would say to that is two things. One, the person that you're referring to is very rare. Very rare. We
Okay.
are seeing an uptick in that problem. We are seeing it. But traditionally, the guiding companies are very good at knowing the limits of their clients. And
Mm.
the truth is, they built an infrastructure on Everest, even for the queues. So they stash oxygen, for example, ahead of time for the 2 hour queue.
Right.
So,
Mm.
you know what I mean? It's not like they get to the top in the queue and they go, oh no, they know exactly that's the first weather window, the first sunshine. They know everybody's going for the summit. It's
Mm.
not a surprise to them. They understand exactly what they're going to get into. Um, the this person who doesn't understand their abilities and puts people in danger is very rare.
Mm.
And it's really a guide's fault if they let them up that high into that place. That's the guide should not be doing that. And we are having a little bit more and more of a problem, but that really hasn't been a problem because it's the guide's responsibility. If you can tell at base camp or camp 2, I don't think this person has what it takes, they're usually barred from going any further.
Mm.
That's
And
yeah.
that's it. So let's talk about the responsibilities of these guides or the expedition leader, for example. And there's a
Yeah.
lot of the lives of those who he or she wishes to take up on the top depends on the judgment of the guys who lead it. So what are some of those responsibilities? And it's not walk in the park by any measure. So what does one expect from a good leader there?
I'm afraid this is probably the muddiest part of my book and my research. It's the part that was the most difficult to unpack because I am a Westerner or I'm an American. I have a certain view of responsibility, right? I was born and raised in a certain type of culture and society with a certain legal system and all, it's so different than say in India, Malaysia, China, which is where a lot of people are coming from to climb this mountain. And what I would say is the big debate on Everest right now is exactly what you brought up. What is the responsibility of the guiding company? And so I want to give you an example. If you go to a Western company and you say, can I please have a discount because I don't want a Sherpa with me the whole time.
Hmm.
I only want the Sherpa at Camp 3 or something like this, right? You want to like change it a little bit. The company will say, no, you either do it our way or you don't go anywhere. So it's
Yeah.
very black and white. If you go to a lot of the Nepali companies, let's say you're 5 Malaysian climbers or 5 Indian climbers, and you say, first of all, the Nepali companies are much more affordable than the Western companies. And one of the reasons how you can make it so affordable is you can go and say, listen, we feel confident in ourselves and we only want 3 Sherpas for our 5-person team. And the company says, who are we to decide?
Yeah.
And to be honest, if it were Westerners that were saying this, I might have more judgment because I can judge another Westerner. But I find myself really, really curious and struggling when I'm judging a Nepali company or an Indian climber or a Malaysian
Hmm.
climber. And if I could say something, there's a lot of things that we could say culturally. I don't know how I could ever reach that conclusion unless maybe I sat in a room with Malaysian and Indian all day.
But it's a choice, isn't it? Then, on that count, an
Mm-hmm.
operator might say, "Look, this is what we have to offer. if you pay for these, we will give you the full service. If you don't want it, it's a capitalist world. You choose to have X many Sherpas or, a la carte menu, and you pay only for this. And it's your safety is your responsibility, not ours. That could be
In
one
a
way of
way.
looking at it then. Yeah.
In a way, yeah. Which as a Westerner, I prefer the Western guiding philosophy, right?
Because they're the experts. The climbers are the experts. You may as well let them decide what is good for you, is how you would put it.
Well, and I would also put it that it's like a safety net that they are the ones who decide. Your ego might be not making the good decisions, right? You might think you're better. You might think you're stronger. You might think you can do it cheaper. And so theirs is like insurance. Like you think you know, but we're going to make you do it this one way. And then the Eastern operators, or I should say that the Nepali operators have much more of an attitude of like, if somebody says they want 3 climbing Sherpas instead of 5, like that's fine, right? But here is the interesting twist, which is why I feel optimistic, cautiously optimistic, is because in the last few years, the fatalities that have happened on Everest have really fallen into the category of what you described. People who got up high and they got into trouble, and there wasn't enough of a safety net up there to help them. Maybe the guide wasn't with them. Maybe they were weak at Camp 2 and nobody noticed it. And so now they're at the top and they cannot be saved. This is a guide error. This is a guiding error, right? As going back to the Western model, that person should not have had that choice to go up. However, this is happening a little bit too often each year. Last year, we only had 4 deaths within the guiding infrastructure, which is of course a tiny amount, but I believe all of them could have been prevented. That's the term they use. These were preventable deaths. And of course, those are the worst kind. And the Nepali industry, I know many of these guides and people who own these companies, they feel shame every time this happens. And there is always like a new renewal to not let that happen each year. And you see it. You can tell when these things happen. You can tell that they are insecure. We can't have this reputation. People can't say, oh, it's a Nepali company, and so this is going to happen. And so things are changing. And a lot of these men and women, Nepali climbers, guides, are just amazing guides, smart, and they're going to run incredible companies.
Because see, we throw these in the corporate world, for example, we toss this word leadership very liberally. You've got to be the leader in the room. But at 28,000 feet, whether it's a Nepali guide or a Western guide, you need to be cut from a different cloth, right? You write about Russell Bryce, who probably ran the biggest operation there for a long time, an immaculate reputation, a big firm. And I found it interesting that he would wake up personally at 2 a.m. to see the Sherpas go up the Khumbu icefall to fix the ladders and ropes. So you need to get your hands dirty, and there is a bit of that's leadership then.
Yeah, the Khumbu Icefall is actually the first thing that you arrive at after base camp. But it is one of the most dangerous parts of the mountain because there is just ice falling all the time and you cannot control it. And I think the example you bring up about Russell Bryce, what it shows is the other big myth about Everest, which is the colonialism, the relationship between the Westerners and the Nepalis, and this sort of profiting off of their backs or exploiting them. And the truth is, it was a really complicated relationship. Man, I don't know how they ever could have navigated it without this reputation. You get what I mean? But they were constantly kind of trying to make it equitable. It just was very messy. And the truth is again, remember I was talking about, I'm going to start talking to people, and if I don't like them, then maybe I have a different story to tell. Again, with some of these guides and guide company owners who have known some of their Sherpa guides since they were children, right? IMG, International Mountain Guides, hired their main Sherpa, Funuru, when he was 16. I don't know, I think he's 40 something or whatever now, and he's their lead guide. They grew up with Funuru. It's like they're family. Do you know what I mean? And same with Russell. Russell Purbatashi worked his whole career with him. They're like brothers. And I think when they use that term, that this is like my family, it goes both ways. It's not just the Westerners making it, something sounding cute, like, oh, their family, don't worry about it. It's like the Nepalis feel the same way.
You alluded to this bit about there is some sense of satisfaction that these guides get by helping someone else summit to the top. And there is a visceral sense of, you get paid for it, all right, but you are helping somebody achieve that dream by taking necessary steps. Is that the biggest motivation then for these outfits out there? You spoke about the motivation of the midlife crisis guys. They have their reasons to climb. But keeping money aside, what is the motivation of these leaders or these expedition operators to do this year after year? Because you also write elsewhere in the book that it's not exactly a money making machine, Everest. So there must be a different level of motivation that spurs them on, and it's hard work. Getting up at 2 in the morning consistently and taking sound decisions at that altitude, and even reprimanding the climber that you need to get down, you are not fit enough to do this, you've burned your money this year, come back again the next year. So there's a lot of responsibility then.
Yes, a ton. It's easy. Of course, they, exactly what you said, they become drawn to, you could even say addicted to, like a climber becomes addicted to climbing a little bit. The guides, there's an addiction to witnessing this transformation, not only witnessing, but facilitating it, being a part of it. And I really, really wanted to show how the transformation in doing something like climbing Everest or like doing an Ironman triathlon, it doesn't matter what the big goal is, but when sometimes the transformation and the moment in your life when you need it is not a small thing. We have to take it seriously. It could be a terrible divorce. It could be the loss of a family member. There's so many things where we get stuck. Does that make sense? Where we have a little bit of trouble moving to the next part of our life. The midlife crisis is sort of, we're just making light of it because, the people talk about buying the red Ferrari. But the truth is, you could probably talk very seriously about a midlife crisis, in that sort of existential angst that pops up in midlife. And not everybody gets hit. Not everybody has a crisis in their life that makes them feel stuck. Sometimes the trauma from a childhood has made them feel stuck all the way. Then the decision is made. I want to climb Everest. And this is going to be my attempt to turn the corner, to experience some sort of transformation. I'm going to do something that is so beyond difficult and imaginable that I have a feeling it's going to help me turn that corner. So now the guide comes in, and the guide is a part of that incredibly important and intimate moment in this person's life, right? They spend 2 months with them for one. So, you get to know the person pretty well, but you also literally have them come off the mountain if you help them achieve their dream. Some people are transformed just by making it to Camp 3, to be honest, or base camp. There's people who are transformed making it to base camp. It's so different for everybody. And I think that witnessing and facilitating that transformation is not a small thing. I think it's like being a heart surgeon and saving someone's life, right? It's a similar, if you talk to a heart surgeon and you say, what's the satisfaction of your job? I think a big part of it is when I save a young father and he can now go back to his kids. I think it's similar. It's like, they're helping this. And I do want to say that, like, I don't have any statistics or evidence of this, but I hope I did get this across in my book, the anecdotes, that the transformation is real. It's not fake. It's not something that you do because you want to say at a dinner party or in cocktails and be like, I climbed Everest. The personal transformation, you talk to everybody, and it's very real for most people. And so that's, I think, where I'm a little sensitive to that myth as well, that the need to climb it is silly or even stupid.
And they put their money where their mouth is as well. These operators who are helping these folks to do that transformation is, even though they are competing with each other for climbs, I read in your book that they cooperate as well, where they use the same radio frequency. If somebody else is in trouble, they wouldn't say that, hey, that's your client, we are not going to pitch in. So at that altitude, when push comes to shove, they do join hands at the end of it. So it's a very interesting space to be in. You're competing, it's capitalism at play, but human lives are at stake. So you
Yeah.
don't want to look bad. There is the mountain's reputation to be upheld, and there is this dynamics between Nepali Sherpas and Western expedition leaders. There's a lot of things happening at that altitude.
Yeah, it's true. The cooperation is a big deal. I mean, I'd say 98% of the people working on Everest are ready to literally rescue another client from another team and completely cancel the climb. Atrocious, like things that are just going to kill them financially and all these things. These things happen quite regularly. And it just shows how tight the community is. And then, of course, though, when someone leaves someone behind, says, oh, that's not my client or something, that's the news story we hear, right? These are the news stories. And I had to bring that up in the book too, this whole idea of leaving people behind, abandoning them. This is very rare on Everest.
Right.
Very rare. The story really is of that Sherpa. Did you guys catch this in India 2 years ago? I think he put the person, I think a Malaysian climber, on his back.
Yeah.
Right? Put the
And he
whole
got them
climber on his back and went
back,
down.
yeah.
It wasn't his client.
He wasn't. Yes,
Yeah.
and I think it's akin to sometimes the guide might stay back with the climber, even though it is not in the best interest of the guide's health at that altitude.
Yeah.
Even if it's an obdurate climber not wanting to get down, even if it's a rare case, it's akin to, probably I'm exaggerating, but a captain of a ship who goes down with the ship is what they expect. So here, I mean, the amount of dedication is to a different extent, although we may not hear those kind of stories all the time then.
Yeah, that's a place where I can't even begin to imagine what the thought process is. I don't know that I'm cut out, say, to be a guide for that reason, because if you imagine going all the way to 96, remember Rob Hall, who died, the very famous story, he died because he was waiting with his client. And everybody there, like if you're being very practical, you know for a fact that he should leave. Right. So they're looking at the math, and the math says you're either going to have one death or two deaths, depending on whether you get up and abandon your client right now. Guaranteed the client is going to die. Guaranteed. And Rob Hall made the decision to stay there. And a lot of people would call that a guiding error. That happens all the time on Everest, in which someone is gone or not beyond rescue, and then a second fatality because the person cannot separate from it.
These are hard calls, right? I mean, this is not numbers on a balance sheet where worst case you'll not make the quarter. I wonder what would have gone through Hall's head back in the day. It's been what's the right word? Memorialized, memorialized in the movie The Everest or Into Thin Air. I wonder what would have gone through his head at the time.
Well, I guess as a mountain guide, I suppose there's like a little bit. Well, I think you said it well. I think it's like the captain of a ship, the leader of a platoon in a war. These people who they just are stuck with this idea that their job is really to take the hit for other people, right? And so I don't want to try to guess what was in Rob Hall's head, but I have to imagine the kind of person he was and the kind of guide that he was. I would guess that he's saying, if I can sit by this client's side, that's my duty, even if I'm going to lose my life. So it's like a military thing, right? I'm going to go drag this person's body back for their family, even if I get shot when I do it, or something like that. I think it's a similar thing like this. So death is always living right there, and he's knows it could happen. Maybe even knows it will happen.
And how much has changed since 1996 to today with technology coming in? And you write about boutique experiences as well, where if you really have a lot of money, then they will try and make it as comfortable, if that's the right word, as possible up there, so that your aim is to go to the top. And we'll help you as much as we can. So how much has changed, let's say, a climber in 96 to 2024, a person who has the money? If you could give a few examples of, obviously there's not going to be cell phone coverage there, or I mean, you don't need air conditioning, sorry, but it's not going to be a hot tea on tap. But what exactly has changed to make people's lives comfortable, so that even if you're not, so if you're reasonably fit and not really Mount Everest fit, you'll get there and get back, and that will transform you.
Well, base camp, I like to compare it to a village. It's not so much like a mountaineering base camp where you have the small tents that you have to climb into and, get in your sleeping bag. It's like they have built, not buildings, they're temporary, but you can walk in and you have a cot. It's really like a village. And there is a coffee machine, and there's a ping pong table, and there's an area where you can do work, like on your laptop, a big common area. It really has everything a village would have. And, the reason for this is because you spend 2 months at base camp. And, I spent 3 days at base camp, and it was extremely difficult, extremely difficult.
Tell me, give me, how so? Because getting to the base camp itself is a big, I mean, it's something. It's not exactly your regular garden or lawn that you just go and come back, because Mount Everest gets a lot of press. Base camp obviously doesn't, but it's tough is what I read. Tell me about it. How was your experience?
Well, it's the altitude, right? And some of us do better with altitude than others genetically, I think. I've never been very good with altitude, even though I'm a climber. The trek was incredible. 10 days, one of the best experiences of my life, and not very difficult, to be honest. The trek is not difficult. There is it's a very manageable amount of hiking every day. And when you sleep in these guest houses at the end, and the meals are good, the people are amazing. So it's a very enjoyable experience. But the higher you go, you're in the final village, at maybe 15,000 feet or something, 16. And then your final day, you hike to base camp at 17,500. So even in the last place, you're feeling everybody feels a little bit off. And then you get to base camp at 17,500. And I mean, I felt awful. I just felt awful. I always felt like I was going to pass out. I always felt like I was going to faint, but I mean, I walk around base camp and I'd have to sit down for a minute. These people have to live there for 2 months. And I think, honestly, they decided, why are we trying to uphold this weird thing about keeping it like a climbing base camp? It's hardcore, it's difficult, it's cold. Why are we doing that? We're running these expeditions. People have to spend 8 weeks here. Why don't we actually go the opposite direction? Why don't we try to make their lives comfortable when they are in base camp? That's the reason they did it,
So you have the basic amenities there, so that it doesn't seem like you are in wilderness or in the middle of a.
You're not in wilderness at all.
Yeah.
At all. And the people who criticize it for that, again, it's kind of like they've lost the point. Nobody goes to Everest Base Camp to be in the wilderness. They go there to prepare for a climb. And it's different. I want to point out that among the things in this village, there's an ER, there's an emergency room, right? There's a very well-equipped emergency room with real doctors. And again, I think it's only a good thing, right? Because people have trouble at base camp.
Yeah. And so the whole idea that you have to suffer to get up there is not exactly necessary. You have to suffer as much as you have to, and use the necessary tools to get there, as long as it is legal and convenient. Would that be the right way of putting it then?
Sort of. Because I will say, a couple of guides said to me, it's a really great way to put it. They say, trust me, Everest is plenty hard no matter what you try to do. You could bring a cinema or a massage place to base camp. Climbing the mountain is still going to be the hardest thing that you ever do in your life. Yeah. So this idea that you don't have to suffer, you will suffer. Everybody suffers on Mount Everest. You just don't need to suffer at base camp is really the way to put it. And there's a lot of suffering above base camp, that's for sure. This idea of suffering more comes from what we talked about. It comes from the climbing world. And I think it is fair if you're a climber and you're trying to plan a trip or describe a trip to somebody and you say, wow, this section was really tough. We really suffered. We were cold. We didn't have the things we needed. This is kind of a cool thing because it means that you stepped out of your comfort zone in that way and you took on a challenge that was unknown. And in the climbing world, that is valuable. In the climbing Everest world, it means nothing.
Yeah, even so, the act of climbing, people who undertake that, their idea is to embrace that suffering in the first place, right? They wouldn't do it, whether it's that pilot or any Indian, middle class guy like me, for example. I really want to do it. Say, I'm stashing away some part of my income slowly and steadily, and maybe 10 years down the line, I might do it. There'll be many people like that. So the whole idea is to enjoy that torture and not just talk about them at cocktail parties, as you said, but it probably might help you find something in you that you didn't think existed. And just because you are having that hot cup of coffee at the base camp does not diminish the experience and the suffering that you have to go through at whatever altitude that you are on then.
No, it's almost like artificial suffering, right? If we only allow tiny tents at base camp and, no coffee machines and don't allow any of these things, and it's almost like making it harder than it needs to be. I think it's a little artificial, right? And, the suffering, as you say, not to sound too spiritual, but I think everyone knows that usually transformation comes out of suffering of some sort. Sometimes the suffering is emotional, right? We go through things that are difficult. On Mount Everest, it happens to be physical. It's physical suffering. Maybe it's both, to be honest. But the suffering, let's be honest, is where the transformation happens, I think. So I understand.
And there's something about physical, pushing yourself physically also helps you discover your mental strength, isn't it? There's a concept like that, right? You need to, from evolution standpoint, where we are, like we are on the internet, you are in another time zone. Before the internet, this was not possible. And if you go back to ancestors, they had to go and kill and hunt and gather food. So we live in an age of indulgence. So that's why we seek these adventures to push ourselves to know what we can. Again, I'm probably it's going in that realm of spirituality. However, there must be a biological explanation to all this, that we really, for me, for instance, my suffering is, can I get to 30 push-ups at a stretch? I'm at 27 right now. So why do I have to do that? I mean, as long as I can walk for 45 minutes, I'll be good enough. I mean, I'll probably stay fit. But we all seek these sufferings, don't we? And we want to see how much our body can take. Some people like David Goggins might take it to a different level, but a few others like you will test yourself at the Mount Everest base camp among other peaks. But that suffering bit is crucial to our existence then.
Absolutely. But I want to say, I don't know, I don't want to speak for you, but I would actually say the push-up thing is an interesting example. I don't think it's, can I get to 30? I think, what if you sat down one day and you said, I am going to do whatever it takes in my life to be able to do 100 push-ups in a row. And you're like, oh my gosh, what in the world is that going to take? It might take me a year. It might take, it feels too big in your head. This almost feels like ridiculous, right? This idea, you're not just going from 27 to 30 or 25 to 30. You're like, I am going to be the person who can do 100. Like if you ask me right now, I could do 100 in a row. Then you just say, that's what I'm going to do. And it feels huge, which is why the journey to get there is, the suffering is worse. The journey is longer. And that's why it feels so much more incredible to do it. But I'll point out, there's one quote that it has more meaning than it seems. There's an amputee climber from Australia named Mark Inglis that climbed the mountain a long time ago. I remember talking to him. He's like a lot of people who had lost legs and whatever and done the mountain. So we were in this time when it was possible to go climb Everest, even if you had lost a leg or both legs, right? That's the era we lived in. Now, when Mark Inglis set off to do this, Russell Bryce was helping him. Obviously, this is a big goal he set for himself. He's not just climbing Everest. He's climbing Everest with what do you call it? The artificial legs, right? And when I talked to him, he said to me, he goes, listen, when you've climbed Everest, it it sort of is like a demarcation in your life. Everything after it feels like, well, if I climbed Everest, I can do this. Everything, he said, feels like that.
Oh.
So it gives you this power. It gives you this kind of superpower in life for yourself that almost everything pales in comparison, emotionally and physically. And I think that when he said Everest gives you this power for the rest of your life to say, well, if I climbed Everest, I can do this, almost sounds cliche. It almost sounds a little bit silly, like you roll your eyes. But I thought about that for a little while. And I thought to myself, not everybody would take this away, by the way. Not everybody would leave the mountain the way Mark Inglis left it. But I thought about
Yeah.
it for myself. And I will admit, I think I might feel that way. Do you know what I mean? I think that if I climb Mount
Mm-hmm.
Everest, there is a part
Yeah.
of me that would say,
Yeah.
gosh, I bet you, almost all the time when some hard things came, I would say, hey, I climbed Mount Everest. I,
Well, yeah, absolutely. I think for me, that'll be 100 push-ups in a row. If I ever get there, I will call you. Uh,
yeah, yeah,
but Will,
exactly.
this is the book that I'm holding up for those who are on YouTube. Please pick this up. Everest Inc., the Renegades and Rogues who built an industry at the top of the world. How many people have you interviewed for this one? There is a long list at the back, cast of characters. Obviously, not everybody makes it in the book. There's a lot of original reporting that has gone in. You've had to speak to the fraternity at large, to those who climbed, those who did not. So, how was the experience, and how did you go about it?
Yeah, it was challenging. I talked to over 100 people, maybe like 120 people. You have two types of interviews. You have people that I need for the book, their quotes, their experiences. And to be honest, half of my interviews, maybe a third, were discussions with people just so I made sure I understood things, right? Like I needed to make sure that I understood the Sherpa perspective in the 90s, for example, when they did not have the skills to be mountain guides. I cannot even begin to try to speculate what they were thinking. So a lot of times, even if I'm not interviewing them for details or facts, I just want to talk to the person for a long time to get a sense of, I don't know, how
Yeah,
much did they feel exploited at the time. Sometimes you can't just ask, did you feel exploited? Because the answer is no. But then you talk for an hour and you think, I don't know
yeah.
about that.
How long did you take to do this? How long was this project, given the
I think it was about two and a
gamut that
half
you've
years.
covered?
Yeah, I think it was about two and a half years to write it, and then there was about a half a year of sort of waiting for the publication date. So sometimes they do different little small things, fact checking, and whatnot.
Brilliant. Loved it, Will, and thank you so much for your time on this podcast. It was fun. I learned
Oh,
a few things about climbing, among other things.
I'm so excited that people in India are reading it. I mean, it's so cool to me. Like I say, it's one of the regions. Um, it's one of the regions that has a very big part of the, is a very big part of the story, and so I
Yeah.
love that it's over there. That's great.
I hope you
Thank
come
you.
down to India sometime soon. If you have any book tour where you have
Yeah,
to, publicize or some such, would love to meet you. Thanks, Will. Thanks again.
wonderful. Thanks, Abhishek. Thank you.